Now, the last thing that we need to talk about in terms of design of the snorkel is the length of the snorkel itself. How long should it be? Well, it stands to reason that the longer the snorkel, even if it's curved, then the less likely it is to take in water on occasions. And although that has some weight behind it, the truth is that the snorkel should be as short as possible. And why is this? Well, this leads us to the second segment of our discussion. What are we talking about?
I'm talking about the dead zone.
No, really, we are. Let's have a quick look at the respiration process. First, we take a breath through our nose, our mouth, both of them together, and that air travels down our windpipe until it comes to about right here, midway through our chest. And that particular place, our windpipe branches out into two smaller tubes called the bronchi. The bronchi enter the lungs. Each of them enters one lung, left and right, and then from there on, they branch out yet again into a lot more progressively finer and finer tubes called the bronchioles. Now, the bronchioles not only become progressively thinner, but they also branch out to every single area inside the lungs until at the very end of the bronchioles, we have this globule-like structure sacs called the alveolar sacs, which contain the alveoli. The alveoli are the cells where the magic happens. These are the cells that in very close proximity to very thin blood capillaries actually have the ability to exchange oxygen for CO2. The alveoli bring in fresh oxygen, give it to the blood vessels, and the blood vessels return CO2 to the alveoli. So it is with respiration. It isn't until that air reaches the alveoli that our bodies actually can get fresh oxygen. And again, this is important because all that area from the nose down to the alveoli is what we know as a dead airspace or a dead zone because no actual respiration happens there. So what this means is that every time we take a breath, the first amount of gas that comes into our lungs is not fresh air. It's basically nothing more than the leftover exhalation gas that remains trapped or that accumulates in that dead airspace from the previous breath. And so this is why you may understand now that a breathing pattern which is very shallow and very fast and very repetitively quick, such as hyperventilation, can be very dangerous. The reason being, of course, that when we breathe that way, we are basically not bringing any fresh air into the lungs at all. All we're doing is rebreathing that exhalation gas over and over and over until eventually, if we continue doing so, we consume all of the oxygen left in that space, and that can yield to loss of consciousness. Now, when we add the snorkel to that whole mix, we are now, by putting the snorkel in our mouth, simple enough, right? By doing this, we are now doubling or even tripling the size of that dead airspace or dead zone. Because right now, every time we do this, we're taking air from up here, not from here. So the whole volume of the snorkel is now being added to that dead airspace. So what can we do to minimize the impact of using the snorkel, which is anyway an inevitable and necessary thing that we must use? Well, number one, never use a short, shallow breathing pattern. Always use long, deep breaths. This is of particular importance when we are snorkeling, but it should be adhered to anytime, anywhere, at all times. If we don't do that, what ends up happening, and I see it a lot with novice divers, I don't understand how to breathe properly, is that we start getting muscle fatigue very quickly. And don't forget that kicking on the surface with fins actually uses our quadriceps, which are the largest muscle group when looked at them, as a whole, both legs. And so they use a lot of oxygen, these muscles. And if they don't have it, they start to cramp out and the diver gets fatigued. But it gets worse than that. It can then lead also to headaches, nausea. It can lead to sort of confusion because there's not enough oxygen in the brain as well. And so the snorkeling experience goes from supposedly being a lot of fun to being a problem, Because a diver that has headache, that is agitated, that has muscle cramps, and who is, for example, far from shore and continues to breathe in this manner may well come to a point where he or she cannot continue any longer before they're back to where they started their dive. And a lot of accidents of overly fatigued divers that couldn't make it back have happened as a result of simply breathing like that through a snorkel. So never ever do a shallow, fast breathing pattern. Deep and slow is the name of the game. Number two, what else can we do to combat this issue? Well, it's very simple. Every time we come back to the surface, the first 10 or so breaths that we take should not be done through the snorkel. If we're diving, if we are snorkeling and we're not diving at all, just looking underneath, that's okay. But if we are doing dives every now and then, even if they are occasional, even if they are very shallow and very short in duration, when we come back to the surface, we should not reinsert the snorkel right away in our mouth and continue breathing through the snorkel. We should spend a few minutes, at least a minimum of 10 breaths, breathing directly through our mouth and not through the snorkel. This can be done by floating upright in the water or by floating on our backs like here. And that way, we are making sure that we take nothing but fresh air and we eliminate the extra dead air space brought on by the snorkel. Very important. Number three, and just sort of a continuation of number two. Every time we're spending more than half an hour snorkeling, and remember, there are people who can spend hours. Spear fishers, for example, they spend hours and hours on end in the water. For those who are planning on doing this, it is very important that every 20 to 30 minutes to take a break, all right? And again, float on our backs or in a face-up position out of the water and take about 4 to 5 minutes of just regular, deep, relaxed breaths without the snorkel in our mouth. This is not a replacement for step number two. This is in addition to step number two. This is done to flush out excess buildup of carbon dioxide in our lungs and to intake more fresh oxygen to help us maintain our muscles fresh and working without fatigue. Very, very important. Now, number four, and this is probably the most important of all the steps we can take because this is where we're getting to the area where really dangerous stuff can happen, including fatalities. Never, ever, 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 ever dive with the snorkel in your mouth. Why? Quite simple. First of all, diving with the snorkel in our mouth is quite uncomfortable. Because if you think about it, every time you dive with the snorkel in your mouth, the snorkel will fill up with water. Now, when the snorkel fills up with water, some of that water can actually go into our mouth. And if that happens, we choke. The other problem that comes with keeping this mouthpiece in our mouth when we're diving is that now our jaws are in a position that is not conducive to proper equalization of the ears. To easily equalize our ears, when we blow through our nose, we want our mouth to be closed and we want our mouth to be free so that in case we need to use several of the different techniques of equalization, such as when we move our jaw sideways and forward and we use our tongue as a piston to push air into our ears, and this will be explained in a different video, but suffice it to say that for equalization, we don't want to have a mouthpiece stuck in our mouth because it greatly reduces the efficiency of our equalization techniques. And so we should not dive with the snorkel in our mouth anyway. But the really bad stuff happens when we arrive at the surface with the snorkel in our mouth. At this particular point, the snorkel is now completely full of water. And in 99% of the cases, how divers get rid of that water is by clearing the snorkel forcefully, by pressurizing that water out of the snorkel. It is that familiar that we've all heard at one time or another when we are near snorkelers. Why is this so bad? Well, like I said, water being heavier than air, the only way that this air can push that water out of the snorkel is by pressurizing the air. So we make a tremendous effort with our diaphragm and with intercostal muscles, and we squeeze our thoracic cavity to be able to pressurize that air. Making this kind of effort at the end of a dive, especially if we are fatigued or very near our limits, is obviously very ill-advised. But it gets worse. When we pressurize that air, then the reverse happens in our lungs. There is a sudden depressurization in the lungs, and the partial pressure of oxygen as well as the partial pressure of carbon dioxide both drop precipitously. Now, this is a condition that the brain is not accustomed to. Our brains are accustomed to the opposite. If oxygen goes low, carbon dioxide goes high. If carbon dioxide goes lower, then oxygen goes up. But a sudden drop in partial pressure of both gases is a condition that is completely alien to our brain. And the result of this is more often than not a syncope or a loss of consciousness. What is commonly known in the world of freediving as a surface blackout. A surface blackout is very dangerous because if the person is by themselves, or even if they are accompanied by a body, but they are not paying attention to them, a diver who blacks out on the surface because of forcefully clearing a snorkel will immediately sink below the surface, where he or she will proceed to drown a couple of minutes later. And so if this person is not brought back to the surface immediately and revived, then the likely result is the death of the snorkeler. And I assure you that I myself have pulled many people out of the water that were on their way down to the bottom because of the simple insistence on clearing the snorkel.
The old manly way. I keep the snorkel in my mouth. I'm a guy's guy. I have enough lung capacity to blow this water out of my snorkel.
So whatever the reasons why you may feel inclined to perform this practice, please discontinue it immediately and never, ever, ever dive with the snorkel in your mouth, even if you have bodies looking at you all the time. Okay? So those are the 4 steps that we need to follow at all times to decrease or eliminate all the negative effects that come from using the snorkel when we consider that the snorkel is a necessary and unwanted continuation of our dead air space. So there you have it. All the things you needed to know about the snorkel, plus a few things you didn't know you needed to know. By now you know you had to know. Until next time, I am Rudy Castiñeira, and this is LearnFreediving.com. Please be safe.